Hello and welcome to VPI Conversations, a video series investigating the virtual public involvement practices that state and local agencies use for transportation planning and project development. VPI Conversations is part of the Federal Highway Administration's Virtual Public Involvement Program, an Everyday Counts initiative. My name is Bob Washington, and I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, Office of Project Development and Environmental Review. Today I'll be speaking with Jane Grover, a principal at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, about using VPI to engage with diverse communities and the institutionalization of VPI. Thank you for joining us today, Jane.
I'm glad to be here, Bob. Thanks for including CMAP in these discussions.
Well, let's get started. Can you tell us about the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and your role there?
CMAP is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the MPO for Northeastern Illinois. We are the third largest metropolitan region in the country behind New York and Los Angeles, and we cover the 7 counties between Wisconsin and Indiana. Our region includes 8.5 million people who live in 284 municipalities, and only one of them is Chicago. There are 3 of us on the public engagement team, and we're part of a larger communications and outreach department.
Can you tell us about CMAP's experiences with virtual public involvement, and how did you get started with the VPI, and what are the agency's goals for using VPI?
We ratcheted up our virtual engagement a few years ago for development of the long-range plan for the metropolitan region, the On to 2050 plan. Our virtual public engagement is just one tool in a large toolbox of methods that we use to reach our constituents and to engage them in meaningful and inclusive ways.
Now, you mentioned that the agency strives for meaningful and inclusive public engagement. Can you elaborate a bit on what that means for CMAP?
Through the public engagement that we've done for On to 2050, it was pretty clear that one of the guiding principles for the plan was going to be inclusive growth. We've been very intentional about, in our public engagement, virtual and in person, to reach our hard-to-reach constituencies, to meet them where they are, and to engage them in ways that are meaningful to them. And so we are still working on developing what this equity lens looks like for our public engagement. But the agency is committed to fostering equity and promoting it in everything that we do. And community engagement is one facet of the agency's work.
And Jane, can you tell us what types of projects have you used VPI to support? For example, do you use VPI for planning, project development, to engage certain communities, or at multiple different project phases?
Can I say all of the above? Because it is all of the above. We've used our virtual tools to support development of local plans in our local technical assistance program, as well as for region-wide initiatives, such as for the On to 2050 plan. So the local community projects have phases for which different tools are effective to reach our goals for each phase. So, for example, early in project development, when we're assessing existing conditions, we might use a virtual mapping tool or an ideas board for community brainstorming. A later phase of one of those local planning projects might include an online forum discussion of proposed options.
And so it sounds like CMAP invested in expanding its virtual and in-person public involvement for its long-range transportation plan On to 2050. Can you tell us about how you use VPI as part of a comprehensive public involvement approach?
Public engagement for On to 2050 was phased over 3 years with the goals to put CMAP and the regional plan on people's radar screens, first of all. So the first phase of the On to 2050 plan development was termed Challenges and Opportunities, and we did over 100 in-person regional workshops with community organizations to educate them, but also to understand their priorities for our region's long-range future. The second phase, we did scenario planning, kind of traditional scenario planning, which we called alternative futures. And we proposed these alternative futures in workshops, and again asked residents to stress test our assumptions about the macro trends that we thought would shape our region's future. And we aligned our in-person engagement with our virtual offerings. So for alternative futures phase of public engagement, for example, our in-person workshops included keypad polling questions, those clickers that you use to answer the PowerPoint questions on the screen. Those questions were repeated in survey questions that we included in these iPad kiosks. So they were the iPad kiosks that we stationed in 25 places throughout the region that contained these light survey questions. So it was about aligning the content, the questions, and being very strategic about how we designed all of this engagement so that it all made sense to folks.
How is CMAP maintaining communication and outreach with traditionally underserved populations following the conclusion of its outreach for On to 2050?
What we found is when you invite yourself to a community organization, engage with them in their issues, and convey to them that you're grateful for their time and interested in their lived experiences, you get invited back. And we continue to reach back to those community organizations and our partners to share CMAP resources and data when it seems relevant to their mission and purpose. So what we also found is that we met a whole lot of individuals whose experiences were relevant to what we were doing at CMAP, and we recruited them to serve on some of our committees as a way of maintaining these relationships with community organizations and bringing their perspectives into the agency.
Now, I know different communities or individuals have certain challenges engaging with public involvement processes. Can you tell us about how you design your VPI strategies to reach a diverse range of audiences throughout the community?
You have to design your engagement responsive to the communities that you want to engage. So in one of our communities, for example, it's a local radio station. In another community, it was the municipal Facebook page. Where do people go for information, and can you be in those places? So municipal newsletters, social media. That's how we've designed our virtual strategies, is about responsive to where the communities are telling us that they are tuned in.
Are there particular barriers to public involvement that you've encountered in reaching traditionally underserved communities? How can we overcome those barriers?
We need to understand that for many of our residents in disinvested communities, there are a lot of things getting in their way. It's tough when you're balancing two jobs. You've got a long commute, you're managing childcare, to peel off time to engage in an hour-and-a-half workshop about regional planning. It's understanding the constraints on those lives that prevent people from engaging. For the Onto 2050 plan development, we did a small grant program, and we partnered with large community organizations, which helped us identify 6 community organizations. They were mostly housing-based organizations, and we asked them to help broaden and deepen our engagement into some hard-to-reach communities. And so we offered them grant funding, and the grant funding was used for them to then conduct workshops in their communities and solicit feedback for us. But they did it on their terms, in their spaces, in their languages, and simply returned the feedback to us. And it was a great way to make connections with those community organizations.
How is CMAP integrating VPI tools and strategies into its public involvement outreach following the success of the On to 2050 plan?
Our intrepid outreach team has mastered a whole new set of skills now that we have pivoted to almost 100% virtual. So we are learning the virtual platforms, GoToWebinar, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Google Meets. We have developed an engagement platform. We are contracted with Bang the Table, and we've used their Engagement HQ engagement platform as a way to kind of centralize all of our virtual engagement with a large set of tools that we can use on this platform. Most of our stakeholders and local governments are still meeting virtually, and we've been doing a webinar series on salient regional issues and providing internal support to our agency to help produce our board and committee meetings. So we are a service bureau both to the agency but also to the region as a whole, trying to build these skills for virtual public engagement.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're really taking some steps to lay the groundwork for institutionalizing VPI throughout the agency. So, how do you make the case to your agency's leadership about the value and the importance of VPI?
The public engagement that we did for Onto 2050, reaching over 100,000 residents with hundreds of workshops, with meaningful input on the development of the 2050 plan, demonstrated to our leadership the importance of investing in a significant public engagement effort, and one that is meaningful and inclusive.
And so, what is next for CMAP when it comes to VPI? For example, are you developing any new capabilities or piloting any new approaches?
I'd love to take you on a tour of our virtual public involvement webpage, the website that we've developed. That we've loaded up not only some transportation plans there for railroad crossings, but also some local planning projects. We've also used this site as a way to support our youth leadership program, the Future Leaders in Planning program. And we're still discovering all of the ways in which we can use this and maximize the use of this resource to help us reach folks.
Now that you've had this experience with virtual public involvement, what tips or advice would you give to someone just getting started with VPI?
My lessons, my advice would be kind of the same. Understand your audience. Put yourself in their shoes, speak their language, anticipate their questions, and don't underestimate their intelligence. Use an equity lens to make sure that you are reaching your audience and finding the right folks that you need to hear from. Meet people where they are, whether virtually or in community organizations, and invite yourself to those places. And then again, use multiple tools and methods. But those are my general pro tips on how to be effective in virtual public involvement.
And so thank you again to Jane Grover of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Jane, thank you for speaking with us today. If you want to watch more VPI Conversations or learn more about virtual public involvement strategies, please visit the website on the screen or click the link in the description. Thanks for joining us.